Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists, amazingly, if you didn't already know, they got it right. They absolutely did, because they were predictive around human nature. Oh yes, this is Tom Navulis, your host, and I am delighted that you are back with me this week as we talk about Economics 101 in Christian Nationalism. Now, I got to give you an amount of background in that at one time, a good number of years ago, I was the chairperson of a constitutional economics group for a small think tank. And in that think tank, our purpose was to look at the foundation of the nation all the way up to and including the Constitution, and how was the intent for the framework of our economic policy. And how did that relate then to our present? And what then would a constitutional economic policy, what should that look like? How should that take and, in effect, operate from that local to a national basis? Quite the challenge, quite honestly. Some of the areas that I obviously did not take into the consideration at that time was the foundational biblical background of our founding fathers and their assumptions necessarily when it came to deriving that real economic policy of the day. As I talk about in the promo or in my newsletter section that's there at samueladamsreturns.net, I mentioned that I was really required to look at the historical theories of the 18th century in relationship to what would potentially be driving the thought processes of those that were engaged in economy. Sam Adams talks about it. I do have a little bit in the references there on Sam Adams' thought in relationship to economy. He tied it both to his Christianity as well as to what is liberty. For the most part, though, in our modern times, the majority of people often refer to Adam Smith, who in the 1700s was a peer of our founding fathers. And what did that mean for them as they were taking and trying to bring this new nation together? Wow, it quite the challenge, really, when you look at it, because what we know and what became problematic that then was the call for the Annapolis Convention of 1786, which I do have references to in the newsletter. There's a good link to it, especially at the George Washington site. I thought that was the most appropriate of all of the other site information out there about the Annapolis Convention without giving you the details of the convention itself. But we're going to talk about that in a bit. But when I was trying to ascertain in this think tank on constitutional economics, what did that mean? It did require that look back into history just prior to what was going on with the Revolution. What was it that England was doing to impact our fair trade, free trade, local economics, local trade, money supply, banking, That was a key one from Samuel Adams' perspective because, as many of you know, I speak about his father doing what was called a land bank and what happened with that and how the Parliament, by that request from the banking system as well as the international trading bodies of the day, forced the land bank in the colonies to shut down anything that looked like a money system. They forced them to shut down and virtually caused Sam's father to become bankrupt. And it was a very, very interesting time. And the intent was, as Adam Smith, if you recall reading about his great work, that when we take and we look at the supply side and demand of what it is that people were after, the majority of our world, Europe and the U.S., was agrarian. Very simple living. We know that here in the United States, at that time they weren't the United States, in the colonies of America, what in fact was going on is that there was manufacturing here. There was that ability to trade across those colonial lines. There was that fair exchange through barter system that was working in the colonies. It was the international trade mechanisms, if you will, that were starting to force, and the whole idea, as Adam Smith was rejecting mercantilism, which was those controlling bodies of merchants, and what did it mean, not just for building individual wealth, but what was it from a societal perspective where people could maintain the dignity of a assumed humanity, as well as look at what was equitable for all people. And then, as we'll talk some in the next segment, segment number 2, is in then that relationship of pauperism and what did it mean and what drove a larger groups of people to become paupers. And here's a hint for you. It was actually the Industrial Revolution that did that. The fact of the matter is that what did it mean for a society to take and be able to develop and grow in those mechanisms of trade, as well as then in how different than today did someone think they were wealthy? What was their valuation of themselves? In our modern times, people are always looking at what's in their 401k, how can they survive without working until, till their death? What does it mean to acquire wealth? And what does that look like? What does that look like? Whereas in the founding of this nation, it was much more simplistic. What were the fulfillment of our basic needs? What was it that you had for shelter? What was it that you had for food? What was it that you had to supply all of the basics of what your family needed? As we become more industrialized, as we'll see, and in the paper that I have there for you to read on Tocqueville and Kuiper in their assessment of pauperism, you'll also notice that as we became more industrialized, actually, we gave up our liberties for a job. We gave up our liberties to become the workforce, the workhorse for, and I meant workhorse, Horse, for somebody else. So when we look at just this introduction to Christian nationalism, what is economics in that? That's not even a sphere of conversation for the majority of Christians because we don't hear it from the pulpits. We don't hear that anywhere in the church conversation. It was to some degree in church conversation during our founding era only because everybody lived within that society and supported one another. The idea of God and family superseded anything else about economy. Now, you know that for the last 10 years, I've been attempting to write a book, Economy Over Liberty, and that's exactly what has happened. And it's even more so in our modern times where even Christians take and turn their minds to economics and the economy and building some sense of wealth instead of understanding family, instead of understanding what are the fundamentals of being frugal, what are the basic needs that are required to live and be wealthy in the Lord. Now, there is nothing wrong with developing an energetic gathering of that even to make you comfortable. But that was a problem, especially as de Tocqueville and Kuiper discuss, is moving from the basic needs into more of the conveniences, as some say, the toys for the boys, that you lose that perspective of what is your real need for God and what is it in essence around your liberties, especially when you're a slave within an economic model, if you will. Well, there are those out there that have tried to work on economics, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the third segment, in what that means in the Economics 101 in Christian nationalism, because it's going to require us to very succinctly look at, and again, I'm not going to be able to cover it all, I never am in these, but as I've talked about to other people and have written about and have dealt with in that small think tank, is that then we have given over to a science that is really philosophy-based. There's an article here that I have for you in the references that actually shows that economics is total philosophy. Economics is trying to answer a question of life. It is taking and attempting to look at a question there that is somewhat is that how should one live? How do you live? What is it that you want to take and what choices are you going to make about what you consume, what you produce, what you trade, and invest? You want these choices to be intelligently and efficiently developed. We want to figure it all out. You want to learn how to weigh those trade-offs. And you want to know that what you're doing, you can make peace with the fact that we can't have it all. So what it comes down to is understanding, as Abraham Kuiper would say, it's all God's. It's all God's. If we start from that premise, and that's a premise that Sam Adams always started with as the last Puritan, it's all belongs to God. And we're stewards of what we have. So when we look at that, We'll have to come back to the next segment of Samuel Adams Returns to be able to delve in a bit deeper. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the second segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those anti-federalists did get it right. This is Tom Navolis, your host, and for all of the references as well as the newsletter, everything in relationship to today's program, I would ask that you go to samueladamsreturns.net to see everything that is available to you, not only in the newsletter, but as well as other materials and historical documents. In this segment, I wanted to follow up from last week on the Tocqueville and Kuiper discussion around and comparison of their perspective on pauperism. As I noted last week, is these two gentlemen were almost peers. They had about 30, 40 years apart or crossed over in their lives. And, it was important to understand how they looked at the idea of what caused poverty. What did cause poverty, and then how do we deal with poverty, and from two different perspectives. I have a lot of just really quick quotes from the paper that is there in your notes. The link is there in your notes, and that paper is from Lee Mai and Jin Lee, and it is called Tocqueville and Kuiper on the Problem of Poverty in Modern Society. Because these two individuals were very close to the French Revolution, they were in the obviously, Tocqueville was really close to the French Revolution in that time period that he even came to America in when he was here in the 1830s, but he was born and lived in the 1700s. And he initially was writing, as I mentioned last week, but just as a review, he wrote his paper in particular in, I think it was 1791. Let me scroll back here a little bit and see what we have. And yeah, let's see. He wrote his actually in 1835. And he gave a speech at the Royal Academic Society in Cherbourg. And it was a memoir on pauperism. And then it was that Kuiper wrote his paper, to show you how close the two of them were. His was in 1891 when he gave a speech entitled The Social Question and the Christian Religion. So very, very interesting. And again, a very close time frame between 1835 and 1891 when they both wrote. So if you go to, once again, samueladamsreturns.net and the program notes for this week, you will see the quotes there as well as the actual link to the paper that we're talking about. Here's the quickies. And we're going to go through this in these next few minutes because I think it's critical, especially if you listen to the mirrors of history, is a lot of what Tocqueville said resonates for our present. He starts out, well, he doesn't start out, but here's the first clip that I grabbed for you, is that legal charity is fundamentally flawed. And what he was talking about is that that is anything that the government sets up as subsistence for poverty is fundamentally flawed. Legal charity. It means and first of all, in relationship to that, there is much abuse of public assistance. Geez, we hear that about that all the time in our present. It nurtured sloth and irresponsibility while depriving people of human dignity. We hear that all the time in our present. Due to sinful human nature, People are naturally prone to laziness. We don't hear that in our society. We don't hear that from the politicians. We don't even hear that from the pulpits. It continues on, is that pauperism made the poor more prone to rely on public assistance, and they lost the incentive to work. So what he's saying is that legal charity being flawed and the ideas of an industrialized society drove people to being paupers because it kind of, do they really want to work or not? And we have that now in our present time, is that we have so many people and so many young people that have no incentive to work, especially after the COVID crisis. People are naturally lazy. But why? Because we're sinful. We're sinful. The paper continues with Tocqueville's ideas that the inevitable result of public charity was to perpetuate idleness among the majority of the poor and to provide for their leisure at the expense of those who work. That was the Cloward Piven Bill. What's his name? Bill who? Bill Hillary. Oh, Clinton. That's it. Cloward and Piven. And what Clinton signed in the reforms of what we have here in the United States now around poverty that went into effect then was to crash our society. And in doing so, it was to perpetuate idleness among the majority of the poor and then provide for their leisure. Hey, here's an Obama cell phone. And now look at what we have going on with all the illegals. So in summary, on this first note, it relates to the human dignity and conscience of the poor. Tocqueville writes, quote, "The poor man who demands alms in the name of the law is, therefore, in a still more humiliating position than the indigent who asks pity of his fellow men in the name of he who regards all men from the same point." And when he's talking about he is a capital H being God, point of view, and who subjects rich and poor to equal laws. That's what's biblically sound. That's what Tocqueville was even saying that. Tocqueville also points out that legal charity severs the emotional ties between people, for donors no longer act out of compassion, but rather are coerced by law, except for all the lefty richies that think they're compassionate when they're not. So he writes about class, and de Tocqueville also speaks to a third point in another unintended consequence of legal charity is the loss of freedom for the poor. They'll stay rooted right there. That's why you hear so much of people not getting out of the slums, except for those cases that really, really work at it, or parents that really help, like Ben Carson's mother, to get them out of a bad situation. So Tocqueville saw it. He saw it from what was happening in England. He saw it from all different perspectives all over Europe, in that legal charity is a loss of freedom for the poor. Legal charity keeps the poor from even wishing to move. Stay in the slums, because everything's going to be taken care of. Now, in contrast, Kuiper points out that the modern root, or the root of modern poverty, is definitely similar to what Tocqueville said, is human sinfulness, that men regard humanity as cut off from its eternal destiny, and it did not honor it as created in the image of God. And we're going to talk about that in a couple of the other papers, is that in the image of God is what man is created. And we lost that. And the biggest loss in that perspective is from the whole idea of what occurred during the French Revolution and all of the philosophers in the French Revolution. So what is going on, and unlike Tocqueville's perspective, which was somewhat influenced by the Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau, who was evil, Kuiper takes a more conservative stance influenced by the principles from the Reformation. So those biblical principles have to take and overshadow everything else. So Kuiper highlights the role of the church when referring to the levels of Jesus' teaching, and in particular, the church has a threefold role. That is the ministry of the word, the ministry of charity, and the instituting the equality of the brotherhood. And what that means is that the church has to be involved socially. The church shapes social, moral, and institutions, or social morale and institutions. Christianity strayed from this in its identity and its mission, so therefore Europe, as we even see today, is in a chaotic disintegration, which then led to its most severe outcome, the French Revolution. So Tocqueville was talking about it from a realistic perspective and seeing and experiencing the French Revolution. Kuiper was going back and reviewing the French Revolution, looking at it from that philosophical perspective, looking at it from what the biblical Reformation perspective is supposed to be, and then saying that Christianity strayed from its identity and mission. So Kuiper believed that this revolution, the French Revolution, brought forth a new worldview and value system that worsened the social problem, and that the French Revolution originated with individualism. The authority and rights of communities such as schools, churches, and other institutions were simultaneously weakened, as was the individual in the political environment. The bottom line that he comes out with is that the French Revolution was anti-religious. It was an attack on God. It was the whole deep-seated social need that it produced was that forcing human beings to seek value in earthly life instead of understanding what it meant to seek God first. Wow. French Revolution did do a lot. It produced inequality and poverty worse than before. And then when on top of that, as Tocqueville brings out, the Industrial Revolution after the French Revolution, what it did is initiated humanistic and mechanistic social engineering to fulfill the needs of human beings. So Kuiper lays out 5 ideological camps: socialism, including nihilism, anarchism, social democracy, state of socialism, the state socialism, and cynical pessimism. And each of these, the core arose in such a way that it was created by the French Revolution in so many different ways, as well as the Industrial Revolution, again being anti-religious, and therefore the French Revolution was absolutely against God and the rule of God. So Kuiper's solution, and you'll have to read it in the paper that I already spoke of and is there in your references, this is about the sphere sovereignty. And the whole idea is that these ideas of every aspect of our lives falls within the sphere of who we are in God's ultimate sovereignty. So that means the family takes care of family. The state needs to acknowledge the sovereignty of God, and the state exists outside of the family and society as a divinely ordained structure to preserve justice. Kuiper stressed that material assistance should be confined to an absolute minimum by the state, or else it would harm the dignity and natural resilience of workers. Sam Adams understood it. Come on back for the third segment as we get back into Economics 101. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this third segment of Samuel Adams Returns. Those Anti-Federalists got it right. I would ask that if you find the programming interesting, that you would go to samueladamsreturns.net. Look at all the different references that are available to you, but I would then ask you to take and find the donate button and help contribute to the programming. So let's dive back in real fast to the whole idea of Economics 101 in what? Christian nationalism. I have several really good references that I would like you to go and take a look at. We'll talk about them. A couple of them are specific to Christianity, Christian economics. One person that I always enjoyed reading from the 70s in particular, but I didn't read him until the 2000s, is Dr. Gary North. Very, very detailed work that he does. But there's interesting work that is from the authors that I will bring attention to. What I want to start out with, though, is a brief history of economics from Investopedia. I've always used Investopedia, especially when I was in the corporate world or in the startup world. Investopedia was always a great source for me. The idea of the science of economics wasn't there for a long period of time. It was all based on philosophy. And as I ended that first segment with, it's trying to figure out, how do we live? How do we live? And then how does a society live? And then it just kind of got bigger and bigger and bigger and became a pseudoscience, is what I call it, because I still think it's all smoke and mirrors and, get the cauldron and stir the pot, and they throw the potion of all these numerics and formulas in there. And, it's almost like black magic. And then they try and determine the lives of people and nations in relationship to what are economics. So the simple study is how societies produce goods and services and how they consume them. That's really what it comes down to, is how the society. So now we're talking sociology, we're talking philosophy, and then somewhere along the way, and I have a very detailed book, I talked about it a number of years ago on the basics of economics. I think I'll have to go and write down, maybe I'll go find the references for you and put that in there to that other program. But in that whole history of economics is that then mathematical formulas try to understand those various components. How do you produce goods? What produces good? What are the leading indicators to produce those goods? And how do you look at services? Whole different thing. Those are, what's tangible, what's intangible, and then how is any of that consumed? So economic theory has influenced global finances. It's very important from where we are in our modern days. It affects our everyday lives, and there's a lot of assumptions around that have changed over a number of years. The largest, or one of the greatest, as we talked about in the first segment, was in the 18th century, the 1700s, was a Scottish philosopher, actually, Adam Smith. Prior to him, in the 14th century, so the 1300s, was a Tunisian philosopher, Ibn Khaldun. And then it even goes back further. If we go into the Middle East and China, it's like what were there as sophisticated financial concepts. So there's an interesting paper that I have there. It's called Economics and the Bible. This was written by a gentleman by the name of Roger S. Nam from George Fox University. Very interesting. He goes through the historical aspect and looking at the history, the deep history research all the way back to, where does he have here? He's referencing someone back to about 539 BC. And then that book was published in 1977. So we have to look at how did the ancient societies even function and operate. Very, very interesting. And then we look at it from a New Testament perspective. And what did that mean? So what was Jesus talking about in the New Testament when he was making his statements? So when we try to understand Economics 101 in what? Christian nationalism, we have to go back and understand our biblical foundation and what was occurring at that time that God had his hand on. It's the invisible hand, if you will, in so many, based on what Adam Smith said. De Tocqueville was then taking and talking about pauperism, and then what the likes of Kuiper was discussing in the ideas of sphere sovereignty. It all comes down to the hand of God is there all the time. And we have to acknowledge that. If we don't acknowledge it, then you're not going to understand a fundamental question that a paper here on the economics of life, and this is came out actually October 5th, 2022, is a book review in Law and Liberty, and in it, it comes back to what is that fundamental question? The fundamental question: how should one live? How should one live? It is philosophical. It is sociological. So when we're looking now at the application of theology, and I talk often about political theology and how our reference and our biblical framework takes and gives meaning to how we take and govern, beginning with self-governing. That's also true when it comes to what is it, how should we live when it comes to our wealth? How should we live when it comes to fulfilling our basic needs? How do we live within an economy? Very interesting. Very, very interesting. So I highly recommend this paper here, or this book review, if you will, The Economics of Life. Gets into a lot of the idea on the various problems and, what does that mean from a more modernistic perspective, and trying to discern what are the standard toolkits of an economist? What is it that we look at as individuals? Here's our interesting concept. If you're trying to decide whether to get married or not, a simple comparison of cost and benefits is wholly inadequate exercise. If you're thinking of having children, no amount of pre-game accounting will help you appreciate the life-altering experience of becoming a parent. These are the wild problems of the title. For the most part, they are philosophical in nature, how one should live, and immune to the utilitarian considerations. In these last 5 minutes, I want to take and bring you into perspective of another interesting paper that will give us an establishment of that Economics 101 for Christian nationalism. And I'm going to have to follow up on this in another program. The title of the article is Economics, Theology, and a Case for Economic Growth, an assessment of recent critiques. and this is by a Noel Eds and Stephen L. Smith. Now, these guys are from two different universities. They collaborated on this work. It is in Christian Scholars Review. They are from, respectively, let's see if I can scroll down here. It's a pretty long article. Ed Noel is from Westmont College. He's a professor of economics there. And Stephen L. Smith is at Hope College, and he's a professor of economics there. Now, when I started looking at this one, is that what is growth? What does it mean for economic growth? And fundamentally, what these guys are driving to when we look at economics and Christianity in particular is not just the Adam Smith idea, but it really drives down to God being sovereign over all things. And then it drives further to the whole point that individuals are created in the image of God. They go through the whole distinction of the creation of animals and earth and everything else, and then the uniqueness of humanity in creation. And here's where I had a lot of conversations in the past with my dad, and it talks about even when we looked at pauperism, we looked at modern society. And so here's a generalization that we're going to kind of, just work through in these last 3.5 minutes or so. So in our modern society, as I've always looked at, especially from being at that particular think tank, was that when we became industrialized, what began to happen is that people moved off the farm and moved into the city. They moved from that supporting that agrarian lifestyle, and they would go because they needed more money or because the national environment, if you will, the national monetary system was taking and forcing people to leave their simplistic forms of life and to seek unemployment and employment within the city. Because you have to remember, a lot of times when people moved off the farm and went to the city, they couldn't always find a job. And then during the Industrial Revolution, we had these new mega business people lost their biblical reference. And again, I always talk about it being lost in the 1800s. So that's even with the likes of, I always say here from the Cleveland area, is Rockefeller, who taught Sunday school, but was a globalist and was evil from the perspective that he did not treat people equitably. And during that whole Industrial Revolution, and we see de Tocqueville talking about that in England, is all of a sudden unionization cropped up because people were not being treated according to the way that Jesus taught on fair wages. If you recall in this last minute, and then we'll pick it up next week, is the simplicity is that, somebody came to work for this one fella in the middle of the workday. And at the end of the day, he was paid the same wages as somebody that was there all day. Now, that's an interesting perspective just to look at in itself without going through the whole framework of that particular parable. But that was an equitable way that God deals with people in fair wages. If there were business people that did fair wages, there would have never been a need for unions except for the fact that business was taking advantages when they should have been taking care of the people. We're out of time, folks. Come on back next week when Sam Adams returns, because He understood this, even though he lived there in the heart of Boston. He understood liberty. He understood economy. And so did our founding fathers. And we'll kind of pick this up once again next week when Samuel Adams returns, because, yes, the Anti-Federalists did absolutely, unequivocally get it right.